Good afternoon, all of you. Welcome back after the lunch. And yeah, this is Yet Hong from the Academy of Hong Kong Studies, and this section will be the presentation of the PhD students of the Hong Kong Studies Research School. As we have a very packed schedule this afternoon, so let's get started. I will pass my time to Alex. Yes, Alex, yeah, you have 50 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, good. I'll finish faster because we had the dinner. Okay, thank you, Tung. It's my pleasure and honor to be here. My paper today I'm presenting is called Preconditions to Interreligious Education in Hong Kong, Religious Heterogeneity, Freedom of Religion and Secularity. I'll give some explanations about terminology later. Let's get started. Okay, good enough. When I just moved to Hong Kong some 10 years ago, I lived in Prince Edward, and this is the building I saw pretty much every day. Very soon I realized it's not just one unique school like this in Hong Kong. There are many. For you who were born here, who studied, and maybe this is not very typical. It's Mary Hall, it's a good one, but maybe you don't see how different it is, but for everyone who specialized in comparative religious education, this religious appearance is quite distinctive. I mean, the number of them. And it's not necessarily Catholic or other Christian. It can be, it can be Buddhist. This is, I think, in Kwun Tong. Yeah, there are still quite many Buddhists, less than Christian schools, but still there are quite many. In fact, more than half of secondary schools in Hong Kong have religious affiliation, managed through different schemes. DSS stands for Direct Subsidy Scheme. Most of schools are managed through religious bodies. This has something to do with, I never spoken in a mask, my glasses. Okay, this has something to do with history of caste, because in Hong Kong, since the colonial time, religious organizations played essential role in schooling, but there are other unique features of Hong Kong which makes religious education and study of religious education really fascinating. It comes to in Hong Kong, despite the number of religious schools, Hong Kong can be not considered a very religious society by any means. I mean, according to Gallup, only 1/3 roughly of Hong Kongers consider themselves as believers, and equally the same amount of non-believers and atheists. And also Hong Kong is quite heterogeneous religiously. I will speak about this later. But still, because there are so many religious schools, religious education does exist, but it happens usually in traditional so-called confessional model, which means your purpose, I mean, when you come to religious schools, you study particular religion of this school. Maybe religion is not a very big thing in Hong Kong, but education is very much a big thing. And historically, because if you Google top 20 schools in Hong Kong, pretty much all of them have religious affiliation. And if students admitted to such a school, it very often mismatch between religiosity and the school. So the role of religious education, although there are many religiously affiliated schools, the role of religious education is quite low. Yeah. And also since 2019, there are constant reforms, and sometimes it has something to do with the change of religious bodies who manage the schools. But interesting things happened recently. I mean, the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years. First of all, government introduced so-called new senior secondary reform, one of those reforms I just mentioned. It was introduction of core subject 4-6 secondarily called liberal studies, and another subject called ethics and religious studies. This is not core, this is elective, also 4-6. But according to Education Bureau, the purpose of this reform, one of the purposes of this reform is to embrace learning diversity in secondary schools and plan implementation of this reform. And another interesting thing is changing and switching scholar attention. I mean, this institutional role of religious bodies in education in Hong Kong, quite research topic. And there are quite many publications about this. But recently, many scholars tried to pay attention to what in comparative education is called interreligious education. Specifically, I will speak about this a bit later, but all these scholars I cite here are interested in how to teach not one particular religion, but different religions, which is in a match with the reform introduced by the government. Yeah, this is the subject ethics and religious studies, how it looks like. It consists of three models, three modules. First is general ethics. Second is you can choose one religion. I see. You can choose one religion from the list, but three of them are not yet ready to implement. And third is integration. And again, you can see curriculum aims very different from traditional religious education. Yes, this is a slide about specific features of interreligious education in general. Yeah, very often it includes not religious knowledge. As I said, it's about study of different religions, but more importantly, the aim of this topic is not to make student a believer of particular religion, but to discourage religious extremism or encourage community cohesion or construct and manage diversity and so on and so forth. And it can be secular as it happens in Europe quite a bit, for example, in Sweden. So this is quite different approach compared to confessional religious education. And also it happens mostly in Europe, this model, because it has, as I just said, it has distinctive aims to improve and solve social problems, such as religious radicalism and tensions, and to teach tolerance. So, what's the title? Okay. In the theory of comparative religious education, this model has certain preconditions. And I use this as my theoretical framework. And the preconditions, namely, are religious heterogeneity of the society. Okay, I need to introduce one more thing. Religious education doesn't happen in a vacuum. It must represent society, must be coherent with the social problems certain society has. So interreligious form of education has certain social preconditions, which are religious heterogeneity, plurality, religious freedoms, and tolerance, and secularity. And the idea of this paper was to look at the Hong Kong society and to see whether these three preconditions do exist, whether it's possible to apply this European model to Hong Kong if Education Bureau does want doing so. Or maybe they just do lip service. Yeah, this is my research question written in more nice words. Yeah, so what are the preconditions to religious education in Hong Kong? And I will explain them one by one. So let's talk about religious heterogeneity and plurality. If you look in Hong Kong, if you look at scholarly discourses there are two competing discourses. One says that about heterogeneity. One says that Hong Kong is global, highly international, East meets West city, and so on. Another one says, quote, Hong Kong lacks a multicultural policy that encourages its citizens to respect other races and provides resources for ethnic groups to cultivate and maintain their well-being and cultural identities, end quote. And I don't want to go too deep on these discourses, but it's certainly possible that both of them are right to a certain degree. But what's certainly sure is religiosity in general in Hong Kong is quite peripheral problem, quite peripheral issues. I mean, we see all sorts of, we don't see any protest anymore in Hong Kong. It's very safe. No one is going to protest. But when it was a protest, it usually doesn't happen about religion, unlike in Europe. And religious identity is also, okay, I'll better skip it, 5 minutes. But what's also interesting is Hong Kong is getting more heterogeneous in a sense of ethnic diversity. I mean, statistically, ethnic diversity grows and ethnicity is often connected with religion, although not necessarily. The second precondition is freedoms of religion and religious tolerance in Hong Kong. And if you look at the legal framework, Hong Kong basic law, if someone still believes in Hong Kong basic law, guarantees religious freedom to Hong Kong citizens. But the funny thing is such a constitutional norm exists in pretty much every country, probably including North Korea. So more important to look at the real indicators. And one of them is social hostility index conducted by Pew Templeton Foundation. And Hong Kong has very low ranks, which is actually quite good. And also low position in Gallup's, I think it Gallup's religion majority choice. What does it mean? It means whether you believe your own religion is better than someone else or other religions. And however, actual religious involvement in Hong Kong, according to Bosco, can be higher. David Palmer just published interesting article about this, an American anthropologist. So long story short, Hong Kong for sure has quite a bit of religious freedoms and tolerance. So its position is quite high, so it's definitely possible. And third and the last is secularity in Hong Kong. Again, if you look at Hong Kong basic law, Hong Kong is a secular place, a place for mutual respect and so on. Christian organizations appear to be most institutionalized historically, but even these 6 religion dialogues plays a bit low profile. I mean, when they think of secularity, it's usually a problem of religion is becoming a part of ideology. This is a problem. But here, in some sense, we have an opposite problem. I mean, religious bodies are worried about China, which is going to, to clean all religious landscape, which actually doesn't seem to happen because the strategy of the PRC is to cooptate religious bodies, not to fight with them. So overall, this threat of use of religion and state doesn't seem to be likely. And to land to conclusion, to say it briefly, interreligious education is certainly possible in Hong Kong, according to these preconditions. But in the countries where it happens, usually there are social reasons for such a movement. But in Hong Kong, it seems to be a peripheral problem. And it's quite surprising that the Education Bureau is doing such a reform. But it can be useful if Hong Kong is becoming more heterogeneous, as it seems to become. Okay, that's it. I'm done. In time?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, let me just open the floor. Let me just open the floor and any questions. Okay, then I have just one very simple question for Alex. It seems that in your presentation you are very optimistic about the interreligious education in Hong Kong. But would there be some as you presented in your slides? These are the preconditions for the interreligious education, and which is can be regarded as a favorable circumstance for the interreligious education. But could there be some unfavorable circumstances for interreligious education in Hong Kong?
Yes, of course. Well, first of all, interreligious education, where it happened, for example, it happened in the UK in 70s and 80s. Interreligious education become to change religious education. So for the system of the present religious schools in Hong Kong, it's quite unfavorable change, to be honest. Would be if it happens. Yeah. So this is one of negative consequences. But in general, if you ask my opinion, I think if Hong Kong becomes more heterogeneous, it can be only better for Hong Kong and for Hong Kong people and Hong Kong identity. Just one of things which can differ Hong Kong and mainland China. Where is okay? Facebook. Hello, people. Hello.
Okay. I think there is no question from the floor. Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Alex, again. And yeah, let's move to the next presentation, which is Marco. Yeah. Marco is from the University of Hong Kong. Yeah. And okay. Okay. Then it should be Samuel's turn, and yeah, Samuel, please get ready. Yeah. Thank you, Alex.
Testing. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Here in present and those on Facebook Live or on Zoom. My name is Samuel. Actually, this is my very first academic paper presentation, so I also thank HKS for the opportunity for me to present an academic paper during my PhD journey. So the very question I'm going to ask and try to answer is about financial inclusion and the launch of a virtual bank. So 2 years ago, what happened is now we can basically do all our banking services on your mobile phones without the need to go to the physical branch. So my question is, does it really promote financial inclusion? Does it attract existing bank user to use more banking service? Does it include those who used not to go to bank, and then now they are using more banking services? So this is an empirical studies focusing on Hong Kong banking customer. So let's kick started. So basically, the question I'm trying to ask is to explore any exclusionary factors arising from the launch of virtual bank. So before we talk about this question, let me give you some background. So in March 2019, so around 2.5 years ago, HKM made a Hong Kong Monetary Authority, which is the regulators of Hong Kong financial institution. He had issued 8 virtual bank licenses for Hong Kong financial institutions. So basically, all now on the right hand side of the slides, you probably see the names of this bank. Now, basically, the common feature of this bank are 2. The first one, they don't have any physical branch, meaning that you will not see any branches. You will not be able to go to a shop and then go to see the banker in person. And then secondly, they are not allowed to impose any low balance fee, meaning that even if you have a very low deposit amount there, they will not charge you any fee. So one of the purpose of having virtual banks in Hong Kong is to promote financial inclusion, meaning that people will not be rejected to use their financial to use financial services just because they have physical or or any other difficulties in going to a branch. Now with a mobile phone, with a smartphone, you will be able to achieve that because now the bank is with you. So now, but actually, it has arised quite a lot of questions whether these very good promises can be achieved in the first place. Now, previously, I have made some observation, which has been published in a professional journal in Hong Kong Institutional Bankers. Now, at that time, we have identified 5 exclusionary factors that that actually could drive people away from using financial services because of the virtual bank. So these 5 factors could be: number 1, the requirement of hardware, software, and technology literacy, i.e., do you understand the technology at all? And secondly, the cybersecurity risk. I'm sure every one of you heard of this a lot about how secure your data is online, etc. And number 3, the change of consumer behavior or customer behavior. How would customer feel when you are no longer allowed, well, you can no longer access to the bankers? And then perception to banks' commitment. And finally, the changes of business model, particularly when most of the virtual bank is a joint venture between existing banks and other retailer or conglomerate. So another key feature that is identified is that the regulation of virtual banks is identical to regulation for non-virtual bank, except the 2 parts that I mentioned about physical branch and a low balance fee. So critics has arisen from existing literature, for example, Lee in 2021, just now. Does it really work? Can we really just replicate conveniently between the regulations of the 2 in order to create the same trust and confidence that we used to place among banks? Now, to answer this question, I have decided to conduct a pilot study supported by my current institution, Hong Kong Student Universities. Now, this pilot study consists of conducting 20 focus groups. That has been developed, that will be conducted in 2 stages. Now, in October 2021, I have conducted the first phase of 10 focus group. Basically, I have invited 32 participants randomly, and through their friends and their recommendation, we have asked our participants questions arising from the launch of virtual bank. So this color basically just see me in different places. We conduct this online through Zoom. We have every focus group state about it's about an hour, and I adopt a semi-structured method to get their understanding. Basically, the idea is to understand the perception and the reasons of this perception. So the only control factor is they are using Hong Kong retail bank, and they are Hong Kong citizens, purely because of language constraint, because we conduct this in Cantonese. Now, so today I'm going to present to you my preliminary findings from this focus group. Now, first of all, the feature of this focus group. Now, I can roughly identify 3 groups there. First of all, we have some groups, they truly adopt the launch of virtual banks. They really like it. They really they become a little big fan of those virtual banks, but still have their concern among them. And secondly, we have a second group which basically resists the launch of virtual banks. They have concern on their relatively short history. They have concern of their credibility, reputation, etc. And we have also actually most of the groups, they basically ignore the existence of these banks. So they probably don't have any reason. Now, however, this is quite magical in a focus group, because although some groups may be characterized by resistance, we might have some very keen person in a resistant group or some ignore group, and we actually have some example experience that some people who used to ignore that, and after hearing those who really love virtual bank, he become more welcome. And actually, in one circumstance, in one occasion, that person really wanted to open a virtual bank, and then decided and asked for the discount code, something like that. So basically, this feature is dynamic, it's ever changing. But the observation is pretty clear. Now, during the focus group, I would like to present 3 of my findings there, key findings there. Now, during the focus group, we actually asked our participants to rank the level of importance of these five factors that I have identified earlier in previous studies. So when the more red you see, the more concern you find. Okay, the more green, they mean that they're less concerned. Now, basically, the red ones are whether the software, i.e. the apps, are user-friendly enough, i.e. whether they understand how to use those software. And second, it's about cybersecurity. What would happen to my data? What would happen if the app doesn't work? What would happen if there's any problem associated with my money? Who should I talk to? And then finally, the most concerned one actually is that they're not even sure whether virtual bank will close down in one day. So I would say it kind of confirmed my earlier perception or my earlier contextual analysis on those issues, also worried by the professional bodies in the banking industry. So here are some quotes about developing trust and confidence, because all these 5 factors will basically make people don't trust or don't place the sufficient confidence on the virtual bank. Now, for example, and from the focus group, we heard these 3 things mainly. Now, first of all, it's about the visible help, because they're not familiar with the surface and they don't want to figure it out themselves. So contrary to common understanding, maybe just doing all by own may not be as welcome as one may perceive. And secondly, cybersecurity, we talk about that, so I'm going to skip that. And then commitment is about the cost of closing down, because without any physical presence, it seems easier to just shut down the computer and then disappear from the world. So that will actually create quite a high level of a crisis on trust and confidence. Now, the second finding is actually quite interesting. All the clients actually prefer online banking, but they do not prefer online-only banking. So if they have a choice between branches and online, they will choose online. But if you tell them, hey, if I only give you online option, they say, no, I still want to meet somebody in person. So they further reinforce the fact that the option is important. The option to meet someone or to talk to someone is still important, and lack of it would actually drive exclusionary factors, exclusionary. So these are some quotes. Basically, for some transaction that consists of large amounts, they would love to meet with somebody. They would love to see people doing it in their own hands. And then for some complicated processes, for example, mortgages, as a few groups have mentioned, would also cater this. And finally, when it involves advisory services, that would be another part. They would really love to meet the real person. Now, finally, the role of regulator. Now, I didn't introduce myself. I was a PhD student. I'm a PhD candidate in the law faculty, so regulatory focus is also important. Now, we actually find out that regulators are perceived, or they should do more. They are hoping that the regulator would be able to do a little bit more to guide those people to use the virtual banks. Now, these are the 4 major areas: public education, handling questions, giving more direction about regulation instead of just copying what existing regulations are, and then improving the policy and the system. Now, the involvement of regulators will drive 3 things. First thing is whether virtual banks is sustainable. Can they live on? Can this kind of business model work? Now, nowadays, virtual banks give a lot of coupons and discount cashback to attract deposit, but does it sustain? And secondly, actually, some of the clients would believe that the existence of virtual bank is to help improve the non-virtual banks, because all the non-virtual banks would have their virtual space in the first place. So would it create some healthy competition? And then finally, are we giving too much virtual bank to live and die by not taking care too much and having too many virtual banking licenses? Now these are the common concern. Now I would like to conclude my presentation with some limitation and next step, because this is driven by a pilot study. I'm going to introduce a second round of a focus group, solely focused on interviewing bankers, virtual bankers, regulators, and those in the field. Now, these focus group mainly focus on client perception. They may or may not know virtual bank at all, but this kind of reflect whether virtual banks is being implanted in the minds of those people. But however, I still believe that this pilot study will identify some exclusionary factors which appears to be quite contradictory to the regulators' wish. So, and therefore may drive financial, well, may not promote financial inclusion, but instead promote financial exclusion. And one of the most important exclusionary factor is a technical literacy, i.e. whether we understand the technology involved behind or not. So I hope that these kind of pilot study will drive to a bigger project later, because currently the sample size is very small, and then I think we need to promote some larger scale survey to identify some more quantifiable and measurable factors that could ultimately lead to financial inclusion report that basically look at how people use the financial service. Now, I would like to conclude with an analogy nowadays that is quite close to your heart. Now, nowadays we are in Hong Kong, because of COVID, we are trying to address to use the Leave Home Safe apps, right? And then I heard a report there are 510,000 people in Hong Kong does not have a smartphone, and therefore they cannot use the Leave Home Safe apps. Now, would it be applicable to the same with the banking industry as well? Should we ask similar question, raising similar concern on software bits? Would be one of the interesting question that is to ask in the upcoming research and studies that I'm trying to drive. So with that, thank you very much. I would welcome any question, feedback, comments. Thank you very much.
Yeah, then I open the floor. Yes, any questions from you guys? Okay, Samuel, then I have one question for you. As you stated in the slides, next steps, listen to the banks. One of the point I can think of is that when we're trying to talk about this kind of the strike the balance between the privacy and the privacy and the technological innovations. And I think to a certain extent we can add one more point to that, is how to sustain that this kind of virtual banking service. And one of the critical part is how to generate profit from this kind of virtual banks. What do you think?
Well, thank you for your question. I think sustainability is a very key concern from the focus group that I heard. Yes, now they are currently generating asset, they're generating deposit, so that it looks like that the bank has a lot of customer to bank with them, and then by then people will feel more confident to use their service, because now I see that a certain amount of deposit. Now, but this kind of exercise is very, very costly, because you generate deposit, you get deposit, you pay the interest, but you did not. Well, if you can't manage to lend out or use other generate income from other sources, you're basically giving out money. Now, how to generate profit? I think it is very important to identify what is the niche of the virtual bank. Now, in my previous article, I wrote about UK virtual bank, etc. Now, in the UK, there are really some spaces where people need to drive for 1 hour to get to a bank. And then virtual bank becomes very convenient because of obvious reason. Now, this is unlikely to happen in Hong Kong. So I'm not too pessimistic about the number of sizes, number of banks, 8 banks in Hong Kong, 8 virtual banks in Hong Kong competing on this space. That is not really good. And secondly, another way to generate so that is not a very happy bit. Now, but the good news bit is, I think if the policy or if there's a change of culture for people, really use the digital money instead of relying on the ATM machine or 7-Eleven to get the cash back, then we may have this one-stop shop. By because one of the participants in focus group actually told me, I never have an ATM. I need to rely on a HSBC ATM machine to get my money back anyway. So why do I deposit it back to the virtual bank and transfer it to HSBC and then get the money from HSBC? Why don't I just use the app from HSBC? So I think it involves a cultural change to make a profit. But I would like to hear more in the next stage from the bank to hear what they're saying, what they think about their edge. Do they really have an edge? So far, I'm not too optimistic. So sorry to say.
Okay, thank you. Then, yeah, let's see whether there are more questions come from the floor. Okay, if no, then let's move to the next. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. And yeah, and let's move to the next presenter. Bami, yeah, it's your turn.
Thank you. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. It's a privilege to be here. My name is Bamidele Emmanuel Ola from the Department of Sociology, Hong Kong Baptist University. Actually, I want to present to you a paper that is still a work in progress, but either I've been able to get some significant results that I think will be of interest to you. And it is about the African migrant scholars in Hong Kong. And I do suppose that we do not have enough representation in terms of learning about their daily life experiences and other issues related to them. So it's a great privilege to be on this platform to share with you some of my recent findings among this category of people. Yeah, I would also like to say that this project was supervised by Professor Chin Kwan Lee, that's University of California, Los Angeles, at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology here during my study in public ethnography with the university, and also from the University of Hong Kong Baptist University. So just to say, by means of introduction, in 2009, the Research Grant Council of Hong Kong launched a prestigious program that was called the Hong Kong PhD Fellowship Scheme. This is the HKPFS. And the goal of the program was to attract the best brains in terms of graduate students from across the world to study in Hong Kong. And they were given the generous permission to come along with their family members, especially your wife who come along with you and your children, and also your husband if you happen to be a married female student. And so, but there was a limitation on this generous opportunity to bring your family members, and that is the fact that there's going to be a restriction in participating in the domestic labor force for all dependents of scholars. So what happened is, if you have a husband who is the PhD student from Africa in Hong Kong, the wife is not allowed to work. And if you do have a woman who is the PhD student, the husband comes here and is not allowed to also seek any means of employment in Hong Kong. So as a gender study researcher or student who is interested in gender study, I wanted to look more closely into this and to see how men, of course, we all know about the masculine ego, will be able to take this. That is, you are going to migrate to a country where you will not be allowed to work. And for economic subsistence,
you have to depend on your wife, and other things like that. So how do they take it? And coming to Hong Kong, how do they manage to live their daily lives? So this is actually what I'm interested in studying. So just to summarize again, what explains gender relations in African doctoral students' homes in Hong Kong, and who does have control over resources, and who dictates what, when, and how in these families in terms of how household chores and key decision-making processes. And more importantly, how does this affect other aspects of life for women? So just a means of introduction, according to Oishi, we see that nowadays women are no longer just following their fathers or husbands to migrate. They also migrate on their own capacities. And Bosche tells us that this gives them the ability to negotiate household decision-making processes as well as gender role performance. So according to Bosche 2009, today the movement of women into the labor force is not just enduring, but certifiably revolutionary, perhaps the greatest social transformation of our time. So, and more studies tell us that access to resources boosts women's likelihood of seeking to renegotiate gender ideologies and domestic responsibilities. So migration provides a new terrain for gender renegotiation. And of course, the 8K PFS program, as well as other programs across various UGC-sponsored, RGC-sponsored universities in Hong Kong, allow students from across the globe to come to Hong Kong and to study with their family members, like I said earlier. Now, the resultant is we have gender patterns and dynamics that we can actually study and look at the families of this individual, how they are coping with gender participation. So just to summarize, so actually I look at two aspects of the migrant and their family's life. I look at the migration history. Why do men and women migrate as dependents? And does motivation to migrate differ by gender? In other words, if the woman is the PhD student, how does the husband takes it that is going to migrate to a country where it's going to be a complete dependence on the wife? So I try to see different theories that tell us, well, migration could be aspiring and it could also be compelled, and there could be other reasons for men or women to migrate. So secondly, I shifted attention to looking at destination lived experiences. That is the daily lived experiences among the dependents. I wanted to see attitudes towards being dependent. How does this differ by gender? And what about the status perception? How do men perceive themselves when they are in Hong Kong? I'm talking about African students, African men rather, and they have to depend on their wife for means of subsistence. So, and then I also look at the daily lived experiences as dependents, and I wanted to see how this differ by gender in terms of household chores and childcare, and also decision-making processes. So the neoclassical economics or macroeconomic model of individual choice tells us that migration can be based on aspiration of positive net returns, because, and some people might migrate because they want to invest in human capital, right? They want to, some people also want to explore, so they could migrate for adventure purposes. And some could also migrate because of expected earnings at the place of destination. And we have another theory that is almost somewhat opposite to that, that tells us that sometimes migration is not because the individual aspires to achieve anything out of it, but he or she simply migrates because of pressures. For instance, there is war or political pressure, or there is a family pressure or cultural expectation. So which of these actually bring African students to Hong Kong? And in terms of household decision making and gender role performance, we have at least two seemingly contrasting theories. The first one is the theory of persistent patriarchy. This theory tells us that, of course, that doing gender is persistent. According to West and Zimmerman, I think we are probably conversant with this if you work in gender studies. And the theory simply tells us that no matter what you do, that gender is persistent. And as such, the individual will play gender. So in families where male are the breadwinners or women are the breadwinners, if gender is persistent, then it means that the traditional gender roles and traditional gender responsibilities will keep on. And then Neta tells us that, yes, in a study of migrants in Delhi, she actually found that women, despite the fact that they were the breadwinners of the family, they were subjected to husband controls. Sometimes they witnessed domestic violence and other kinds of abuses. So on the other side, we have another theory that tells us that, well, if the woman becomes the breadwinner, we could have a case of compromised masculinity, which Susan Choi calls masculine compromise. Some men might redefine masculinity to mean that a good man is a man who supports the wife. So if the wife is more prosperous, she has higher resources, yes. A good man is a man who allows her to explore, to develop human capital potentials and all other things. So, and we have an empirical study that tries to justify this. So just to keep up with time, so we could place this side by side to actually try to understand the reality of African male and female students in Hong Kong. Okay, so just to summarize the theories and my study interest, I looked at migration motivation. Is it aspiring migration? Is it compelled or something else? And when we talk about attitudes towards dependency status, I'm looking at what the men and how the men and women handle it, because some of these people were already working, they were well-to-do, so to speak, before they came to Hong Kong. So how do they see the dependency status? For men, more importantly, do they see it as benefit or do they see it as a threat to their masculine ego? And finally, I wanted to see household chores and decision-making participation, whether we have examples of masculine compromise or persistent patriarchy or something else. So, so my study is the method. I actually, all my respondents, as I said, were Africans, Nigerians to be precise, who are studying for their doctorate in Hong Kong. And I was able to get my respondent through Snowball, because we have a very strong and reliable association here. That is the Association of Hong Kong, Association of Nigerian Scholars in Hong Kong, ANSHK, which is doing well to assist a lot of Nigerian students and other African students, as the case may be. So I was able to study 6 families, actually, and 2 of them were female-headed. I mean, the ladies were the women were the head of the family, and 4 families also that were male-headed. So, and what did I find? I found examples, evidences of aspiring migration. This is a man whom I call Charles, not the real name anyway, a pseudonym. He said my attention was more on the exposure when I wanted to come to Hong Kong. I was asking myself, what is this journey all about? What quality will it add to me? What exposure for my wife is in there? And the knowledge to be gained from the whole adventure, especially for my wife. I consider the economic aspect solely my responsibility. If I join her, I can get connections. I can run family businesses and send money home and all sort of things. Compelled migration, we have for the women, for men, I found more of evidences of aspiring migration, but for women, I found evidences of compelled migration. This lady, for instance, says, I was working in a bank and it came, that's the husband as a client. That's how they met. Anyway, they got married. Then it occurred to her that she had to leave her work and join her husband in Hong Kong because he got a PhD scholarship. So she had to tender her resignation. And I asked her, why did you resign? She said, because I had to come down to Hong Kong. I have more than one reason. First, it will probably be based on culture, that when you get married, you have to stay close to your husband. 2 things. 2, things can get better than where you were. Another is from Africa, to be precise. People are counting from your wedding day. They are expecting you increase so your multiplication can start. In other words, you should start building a home, raising children. So this woman migrated, unlike the man that migrated because of economic aspiration. The woman migrated because she wants to stay close to her husband and bear more children. And I asked her if anybody tried to discourage her, and the answer was in the positive. From the economic aspect, the boss at work was trying to discourage her from joining a family, just, and resigning from her work. So I tried to flip the coin and ask the husband if he would be willing to, take up the same sacrifice, assuming it was the woman that was the breadwinner and was the PhD student, if the man would leave his work and come and study in Hong Kong. And his response was, of course, this kind of issue has always been coming up. And I've always told my wife, of course, assessing it, the situation will determine. And it won't make sense that if it is outside that I'm working in an oil company, for instance. So who is doing better at the moment will determine. In other words, for man, it is still based on economic calculations. But for woman, it is more of aspiration. Topper interjected and said, to be honest, most men will not do that. In other words, men will not quit their jobs because they want to join their husbands in Hong Kong and all that stuff. So he is the head. So just to summarize, so what about household decision-making participation? First, I looked at the definition of male dependent. How do men see themselves depending absolutely on the woman? And this is the response. A male respondent, a male dependent told me, as a male spouse to my wife, honestly speaking, from where we are coming from, man is there on top. It is top down. It is an awkward feeling. I refer to it only as a term on paper. And for a female breadwinner, she said, so I asked a female breadwinner, how is it for you to be a female sponsor? How do you interpret that personally? And she told me it's tough and it continues to be tough until there is some kind of breakthrough. In other words, she's also expecting that the husband will be able to get some means of livelihood and live and, get more of his masculine ego back. So just to summarize, some of my findings, so some men were more willing to migrate and become dependent based on calculation and expectation or aspiration of economic benefits in conformity with the neoclassical predictions. And women were more willing to be dependent than to be sponsors. Women actually wish that the roles were reversed, and men had the final say in decision-making processes, whether they were sponsors or they were dependents in these families. And male dependents have access to their female sponsors' bank account. And I didn't have time to talk more about that because this is just a summary. And men hardly do household chores, despite whether they were the sponsors or they were the dependents and they had to stay at home, they hardly do household chores. Unlike male sponsors, female sponsors manage their time by leaving home late and returning early. And some dependents said the road could be long and depressing. So I think that would be a summary of what I found. So in summary, we see that in African migrant doctoral students' families, persistent patriarchy is a reality. And despite the fact that the woman is the PhD student and she's the sponsor of the family, she still continues to do all the household chores as though she were not the sponsor. So the economy does not really suppress the effect of traditional gender role performance. Thank you very much.
Yes, and once again, any questions from the floor? And I'm now open the debate. Okay, yes, then Bami, yeah, one question for you. I think actually you have already mentioned that, and that it shows that in your study that actually male is still in the dominant position, and despite the fact that actually some of the female actually can, if I'm correct, please correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, some of the female actually can depend on on themselves, but yeah, but the male dominance, it seems that persists over there. So, what, according to your observations, what is the reasons behind that?
Behind
the male dominance, yeah, despite the fact that some female actually have their ability to find work and actually they can depend on themselves.
Yeah, actually, the case of Hong Kong is peculiar compared to other countries that I studied, like Germany, the UK. In these countries, dependents are still allowed to work. If you are a male dependent, you are still allowed to work, although the number of hours you work can be regulated, right? But in Hong Kong, as a male dependent, when the woman is your sponsor is on student visa, you are not allowed to participate in any form of work, and the same applies to the man. So I think this is a big challenge to many African men. I'm talking about husbands of female doctoral students because of the way they were trained up. You know, the masculine ego is that the man is supposed to be the head of the family and is supposed to be the source of economic resources for the family. But now the reverse is the case. The money is coming through the wife, and he has to depend on the woman, right? Because he cannot work. And the woman is going to be in Hong Kong for 4 years of PhD study, sometimes 3 years, right? So for those 3 years, his life is dependent on the resources of the wife, right? So some of the participants were actually lamenting that this is not a case that they really expected. They wish that both dependents can also do some kind of economic work, even if it's regulated, right? But that is the expectation. And for a man to come to Hong Kong and then is almost redundant to sit at home, this again can generate another ground for domestic violence or transfer of aggression, you know. So the problem is not, but before they came, ab initio, the law is already there. The Hong Kong Immigration Department said the law. If you're coming to Hong Kong as a dependent of a student, you are not allowed to work, right? It is stated there. In other countries, probably they are allowed to work. But this is the peculiar situation of Hong Kong, and it gives me a ground to actually study through in-house ethnography, how the family, the male-headed family and the female-headed family are trying to settle this, right? How to maneuver and live their lives with this. So I think for me, it's quite interesting to see that despite the fact that things could be very tight for PhD students, whether they are males or females, the female PhD students who are the full-time students, they still try to compromise their time and then they try to compensate. Some of them leave home maybe around noon, 12 noon, so that they first take care of their children and also their husband. Then they go to the lab, they work, they leave the lab early, they come back and take care of the family because most of these things the man may not do it. So it is a challenge to them, and it also affects their study also. So, and another, just to summarize, another thing is if the dependent, like the male, is allowed to work, probably he has some of his ego back, right? And there is less conflict in the home. But all the same, whoever is the sponsor, what I found is that patriarchy still persisted. And I think it's a case I'm quite interested. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bami. And yes, and thank you very much. And yeah, let's move to the next presentation. Yeah, Vicky, yeah, this is your turn.
Hi, everyone. This is the title of my presentation, and today I will basically try to discuss about the early colonial attempts to adopt some of the local institutions to the practices of colonial governance. And then today I will basically try to focus what were the underlying factors that actually informed this decision. The document that I have here is Ordinance number 14, and it was legislated in 1844 by the second governor, John Francis Davis. It was the first ordinance regarding the appointment of local inhabitants to the colonial village police administration, fashioned as native Chinese peace officers. Just a quick reminder that this ordinance was meant for places other than the Victoria City, which would be today's Central, where most of the Europeans were located. The position that this ordinance created was presented to be drawn from the system called Bauja, which was traditional community-based law enforcement system. These officers were unpaid, subordinated under the English magistrate, and were required to perform policing duties. It was legislated on the premise of non-intervention, which attributed to the theory of imperial good governance. That is why we have words such as preservation finding its way in the ordinance preamble. This approach of colonial governance was usually described as conservative and pragmatic. This was the second governor, Francis Davis's idiosyncratic response to the governing situation in Hong Kong. It arose from his personal initiative, considering the issues he confronted when he arrived, like primary of which was the jurisdictional tension with the Qing government over the Chinese population in Hong Kong. Adding to this were the mounting disorder in the colony and extreme resource crunch. It was due to these factors that the ordinance was largely seen as practical, implying absence of thinking or any ideological commitment involved. But when I attempted to look at how Baojia appealed to Davis and not the one which was already existing in the society, it appeared that his past experiences and his own understanding of the system played quite a role in the making of this ordinance. So my intention in this paper is to look at the formation of colonial knowledge and the political and intellectual influences that shaped it and its connection with the process of colonial state building. Since the adoption of Baojia occurred when the discussion of a jurisdiction was still going on, so I want to begin by looking at the early jurisdictional complexities. Before the Treaty of Nanjing was officially ratified in June 1843 and ceded Hong Kong Island formally to the British, Qi Ying, he was the imperial commissioner who was tasked to deal with the Western powers after to negotiate treaty for the Opium War. He was sitting at the Canton, and then he advanced a claim of complete legal jurisdiction over approximately 4,000 native inhabitants scattered across the island initially. When this resulted in outright rejection from the British, a framework of shared jurisdiction was then advanced. Qi Ying justified his claim based on the legal privilege of extraterritoriality that the Westerners were given in the treaty port areas as an aftermath of the Opium War. Extraterritoriality, which functioned on the principle of legal order, plural legal order, exempted Westerners from the Chinese law. This Chinese proposition resulted in protracted discussion within the official circle in London, as it directly touched on the issue of British sovereignty over Hong Kong. A colonial office under Lord Stanley, drawing on the notion of exclusive sovereignty and fixed territoriality, disagreed with the Chinese claim and argued for complete legal jurisdiction over native Chinese in Hong Kong. The colonial office's argument was informed not only by the anxiety that the presence of Chinese imperial authority will threaten the status of Hong Kong as a colony, but it will complicate the judicial process as well. In contrast, the Foreign Office under Lord Aberdeen, apprehensive that the further resentment would endanger extraterritoriality in treaty ports, and by extension further delay the treaty ratification, he ostensibly supported the idea of shared jurisdiction, referring to the East India Company Court in Calcutta. In East India Company courts, the principle of non-intervention, at least theoretically, was practiced regarding native administration of justice. In this court, informed by the Roman civic law thinking, in terms of civil matters, Hindus and Muslims were allowed to be governed by their respective laws. However, in terms of criminal matters, Muslim law were applied universally. Referring to this, the Foreign Office agreed to Chinese proposition of shared jurisdiction, where criminal law would be administered by Chinese mandarins. But this arrangement rarely found any practical implementation because Qi Ying's claim was continued to be seen as contest to British sovereignty. It was imperative under these conditions that British develop a mechanism to refuse Chinese assertion and bring legitimacy to its authority. It was to these efforts the colonial state through police control attempted to exclude Chinese influence. In this situation, recruiting local officials to assist in colonial police administration became significant to apprehend Chinese offenders before they could be claimed by the Chinese police. Now, let me briefly discuss what Baojia was. Revived under the Qing government, the system was collective neighborhood organization for civil control and law enforcement. It was constituted of three-tier structure, as you can see there. It was expected that the Baojiang, the head of this institution, report to the district magistrate and operate independent of village authorities. And the leadership was usually drawn from common villages, not from the village head or clan heads. The system was hoped to bring far removed villages spread across the empire under the ambit of direct state control without apparent involvement of state machinery. So let me briefly discuss about Davis. John Francis Davis, he started as a companyman in Canton factory in 1813. His company career lasted until 1835. During these years in Canton, he worked in different capacities, from writer to sinologist to a chief superintendent of British trade. He was the son of the director of East India Company in Calcutta. He produced a huge body of knowledge on China, which became one of the influential reading for understanding China to the Western audience. Davis, as a companyman in Canton, lived through the shift that was taking place in European relation with China leading up to the First Opium War. Existing scholarship suggests that because of this shift that was taking place in the relationship between Europe and China, his own imaginary of China changed from admiration to degradation, which became very prominent in the writings he would publish in the 1814s and even in his dealing with China as a governor. The issue of jurisdiction was actually did not started in his period. It was something that was left behind by the first governor, but it was him who took it more seriously than the first governor. These are the volumes that Davis authored, where we can find his early description of Baoja. It was published in 1836, followed by new editions in 1844 to 45, along with a supplementary edition. These works were based on the empirical experience he had as part of the diplomatic entourage of Amherst Embassy, which took place in 1816 to 17, and combined with his observation in Canton. Davis and his work covered a wide array of things. In the chapters dedicated to major cities, which are like Peking, Nanjing, and Canton, that he traversed, he detailed the administrative and physical aspects of these places. Peking constituted one complete chapter for itself, and we find mention of Baoja in this chapter when he recounts Peking city and its layout and discusses how the city was designed to keep emperors safe and how it relates to the emperor's insecurity. It was in this context that Baoja pops up, and he states that the strict system of police was also part of that same idea and was practically implemented to rid the emperor of the anxiety about his subjects. Further, he wrote that the system sought to allot duty to the individual members of surveilling each other rather than one contributes to effective control of vast population. Although he believed it to be impressive as an instrument of governance, but in the book, he subtly criticized the excessive control that the system sought to achieve, and he epitomized the authoritarian nature of Qing rule by emphasizing the powerlessness of the majority subject by citing the phrase, "the meat is on the chopping block," and the meat was supposed to be the larger population. Despite identifying these elements and characterizing the Qing rule at large, ironically, Davis attempted to implement the same principle in colonial Hong Kong when he became the governor, and he used the same understanding to justify some of the colonial regulations and argued that Chinese population hardened under imperial China is yet not ready for liberal policies. And we compare his description of Baoja with the existing research on South China. Most of the work suggests that Baoja was not as effective. It was a failed project because of the strong village organization, which rarely allowed Qing officials to intervene in the village matters. When Davis implemented the ordinance, he presented Baoja as something similar to English tithing system, which was prevalent in medieval England, which was generally found within the limit of manorial estate. And as the manorial estates were usually not large, so it was very effective for the lords to control his estate. His translation of Baoja as English tithing was very consistent. And when he discussed Baoja in his book as a two-tier system of tens and 100 houses, like if you can see here, so these are the description. Every town is divided into, this is his description. The structure that he mentioned in the book, every town is divided into things of 10 houses, and these are like combined into words of 100, or as Chinese town made 10 houses make a kia and 10 kia make a pao. These are like clearly Romanized Cantonese, and he was actually referring to two-tier Baoja, which was prevalent in South China in whatever form it was. But even then, it was not the 10 households which constituted a basic unit or jia and 10 jia above, but it was 100 households that constituted a jia and 1,000 households above. And in addition, he suggested that Baoja was essentially the same through the different cities and towns of the empire. So in his accounts, the regional variation, which added to the complexity of this system, did not surface much. In colonial Hong Kong, he sanctioned a form of Baoja, which was distinct from pre-colonial Hong Kong, because when the Qing government attempted to make Baoja work, they had to adapt the system because the original did not fit with the village setup and delegated Baoja leadership to village or clan heads, whereas Davis attempted to reverse this. In addition, hoping to make the system more effective, Davis entirely overhauled the selection process. He reversed the right to himself. He reserved the right to himself to approve each Chinese officers after they were collectively selected by the villagers. In this process, the revived native institutions such as Baoja not only brought the village under direct scope of administration, but it brought the area which had long evaded state control in pre-colonial period under the direct supervision of the state in the colonial period. The other important aspect from his understanding that comes out is that by equating Baojia with medieval English stating system, he attempted to understand China in relation to England, and in a way he involved in classification of Chinese society and history, which carried with it a presumption of hierarchy. So to conclude, I would say that looking at the process of adoption of local institution amid the Chinese legal assertion in early colonial period reveals a contradiction between the ideas of non-intervention and colonial need for bringing Chinese inhabitants under the direct scope of administration. And the system was that Davis attempted to preserve was traditional in the sense it was manned by local inhabitants, but in its conception, it was not. Yeah, thank you. That was the end of my presentation.
Okay, thank you. And yes, yeah, I hand my time to the floor. Any questions from the floor? Okay, thank you. Then, yeah, one question for you, and I just curious, how do you come up with this topic? Actually, I'm quite yeah. Because why do I say so? Because it's that uh uh it is quite how do I put this? It is yeah, this is to me. This is a very special angle of in evaluating or examining the so-called the indirect rule of the colonial British government in Hong Kong. So how do you come up of this angle with the with starting your argument from the Baojia system?
Oh yeah, because there are like already like works which looked at the like the knowledge system, how it like even though it's like these are the most of the work that was like presented by the scholar administrators, but you just don't look it as the work, but then you have to there are like many works which works and looks at the politics of knowledge, and then what it tries to like achieve, it's just not as like the knowledge is like, especially I'm looking at this template from the like Edward Said. I don't know if you've heard about him. So yeah, he talks about the structures of knowledge, how it works on the assumption, and then even the all the works that was presented was interpretation and assumptions which actually underwrote European knowledge, and then that was actually producing hierarchy between the one and the other. So I try to look at it from that perspective.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Then let's move to our next presentation. And yes, Michael, this is your turn.
All right. Hi everyone. My name is Marco. I'm from the Department of Counseling and Psychology, Hong Kong Xi'an University. The title of the paper I'm presenting is Body Image and Transgender People in Hong Kong. So let's have a brief introduction first. I assume a lot of us may not be very familiar with transgender issues. So here are some key terms. First one, like gender affirming surgery, also known as sex reassignment surgery. Hormone replacement therapy, literal meaning is exactly just what it says, self-explanatory, using hormones to help the individual to align the sexual characteristics with their self-identified gender. Medical transition is the use of hormones and or surgical procedures. Non-binary or gender fluid, meaning people who are perhaps do not identify themselves as female and male, or at the same time they identify themselves as both. Social transition is a bit like medical transition, but it focuses on the social role. And last but not least, this is a very important acronym. TGNC is the acronym for transgender and gender non-conforming. So basically, in the presentation that I'm going to give, transgender and TGNC, these two terms are basically interchangeable. So how to call them? Well, in English, there are a lot of terms like MTF, that means male to female, or FTM, or AFAB, AMAP, that means assigned male or female at birth. We may also call them trans men and trans women. In Cantonese, the most accurate term would be Khoa Sinh Bị Yan Si. So literal translation would be transgender people. But as you can see, it's a big but. This is not exactly something very academic, but this is something happening in the real world. I compare the keyword search specifically in Hong Kong for 5 years, 2016 to 2021. The orange line is a bit more there. The orange line is the search for Yan Yu, a human monster. The red one is Yin Seng Yan, change sex people. And the blue one is Khoa Sinh Bị Yan Si, that's transgender people. When you see the bars on the left-hand side, the blue one is almost, you almost can't see that. So what I'm trying to say here is that transgender people probably in Hong Kong are facing a lot of discrimination, even for naming. For naming them, most of the public probably they're still calling that Yan Yu, calling them Yan Yu. So, whereas my topic is about body image, so this concept is must know. The passing concept means that to have behaviors and gender expression aligned with the gender stereotypes. That means if I were born as a girl, I am a trans man. That means I identify myself as a man. If I look like this, you say, okay, Marco, you are a man. Then I am very past. That's the concept. And previous research on this passing concept, previous research found that it actually contributes to a lot of insecurity in TGNC people. And they feel that they are being judged by the gender binary stereotypes. Another concept is cisnormativity. As easy as it appears, is about cisgender. That means 順性別. So I was born as a male. I identify myself as a male, so I'm a cisgender male. Cisnormativity means that cisgender is the only normal. And actually not only cisgender community, but also TGNC community, they are, many of them are actually believing in this. So my study, the method is this. Let's talk about the participant first. Well, the reason for me to have this study is that I want to know under such kind of circumstances, particularly in Hong Kong, people may still be a little bit behind. That means we are still using a lot of not so accurate terms or derogative terms to name them, to call them. So they must be probably having a lot of stress. And because of the cultural difference, so I would like to know whether this thing, this under such kind of stress will have a big impact to the TGNC people in Hong Kong. Since the population of TGNC is unknown, then I will follow the ratio from previous study. It's around trans women to trans men is about 2.2 to 1. So basically, I have recruited more trans women. In total, I recruited 15 TGNC people. Here's the breakdown table. 8 of them were trans women, 5 of them were trans men, and 2 were gender fluid or non-binary. The middle column and the right column, they are not mutually exclusive. That means for people who have the surgery, they still have to take hormones. So, as we can see here, only 6 of the trans women, they are having the hormone replacement therapy. In other words, 2 of the trans women, they identify themselves as female, but they are not taking any hormones, nor they had any surgery. Semi-structured interview was used. Everything is recorded, audio recorded, transcribed. There were 3 participants having the surgery during the study period. So they were interviewed twice. Apart from the 3, the other 12 were interviewed once. Well, I was not as brilliant as the speaker yesterday, so I need to have some software to help me. I used NVivo 11, that is the qualitative qualitative software to help me code and to help me get the list of themes. So here are some findings. Basically, I've spotted 3 themes. The first theme is that binary gender concepts and gender stereotypes are quite prevalent in among the TGNC communities, or I should say, be more accurate, among the participants of my study. Theme 2 is that gender stereotypes is probably due to transphobia. And the last theme is that body dysphoria is a key motivator to medical transition. Now let's focus on the first one, binary gender concept. 13 out of 15 participants, they displayed the tendency agreeing to the gender stereotypes. So in this study, participant MA and JO, they identify themselves as non-binary or gender fluid. Whereas FI, she identified herself as a trans woman, but she is having a split life. That means at work or in the family, she is a he, but she only played the female role when she is with other transgender people. So what I'm trying to say is that gender is not as linear or as polarized as many people may think. It's not just male or female, but ironically, in the TGNC people's mind, they may actually follow the gender binary stereotypes. I would like to give you some quotes of my participants. This person, PA, she's a trans woman, and she actually pinpointed this paradoxical phenomenon. She said, we're trans women, we always want to present ourselves as very feminine, trans men, very men, but then this is exactly fitting into the gender stereotype, and this is not what transgender like. AS and other trans women, she is very cute. She's saying that if she sees a trans woman like not wearing a female attire or even having a beard, she will say, what do you want to do? She actually said that. She said, I'm a very binary person. Well, the conversation was in Cantonese, but binary person, these 2 words she used in English. So what I'm saying here is that, well, gender stereotypes, definitely, it is more than appearance, and in a lot of transgender people's mind, it is something very binary. Oh, and also, 3 participants, they are using the phrase 整己的孙 to express themselves in their narratives. So what this is a quote, but I don't think I have time to go through all these. JO, well, this one I have to go through. JO is an interesting thing because JO is non-binary, gender fluid person. So in such case, when we address gender fluid person, we use the singular they. So they was born as a boy, and they would like to appear more feminine, but then the male identity is prohibiting him to do a lot of things. The second theme is about gender stereotype, is due to transphobia. Well, transphobia could be from other sources and could be from inside as well. Well, this is a quote I'm not going to go through, but BC trans woman, she's having a lot of stress or boys don't cry concept from her father. So she has been, adopting that gender stereotype just because of her father's transphobia. Internal transphobia could be a possible reason as well. And for JL, he's a trans man, he started to stop his own bias towards TGNC people when he started his own gender transitioning. So I would think perhaps gender transitioning is a way to help people to face their internal transphobia. And the third theme is body dysphoria as a key motivator to medical transition. Body image is always an issue for TGNC people. A lot of people, they are using the mirror image as talking about mirror image when they talk about their gender and their appearance. One of the trans men here actually said, "Oh, when I look into mirror, it's like watching a horror movie." But interestingly, when two of the trans women, they are having low body dysphoria, they don't really hate themselves as male, but they fancy being female. For both of them, they did not have any medical transition. So what I speculate here is that perhaps without high body dysphoria, that means if they don't hate their body, probably they don't have the urge to go for the medical transition. So a little bit of conclusion. The significance of this study is that when practitioners, if they have a better understanding, they can provide better or higher empathic understanding, and that could achieve a better therapeutic outcome. Well, this is something I add in after listening to yesterday's talk. Well, social impact. And I would say this study may lower the burden of local public healthcare system, promote diversity in society, and cultivate harmonious society. And limitations, of course, this one is just cross-sectional, capture time points. So future research may consider longitudinal and also add in some quantitative elements, because mine research is solely purely qualitative. And that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Personally, I would like to use my privilege as moderator to ask you a question first before I open up the floor. Right. Yeah, as you mentioned in your presentation, actually, transgender should be very fluid, should be a fluid or a non-binary concept. And in your study, but it reveals that actually the LGBT group or some transgender community people, actually they have some sort of binary thought. What do you think about that? What is the reasons behind that, according to your observation?
I think it's more like but they don't want to, but consciously they don't want to be fitting themselves into the binary, because naturally they are not the binary, because they are not the cisgender people. But at the same time, it's like playing along with a game, because cisnormativity is everywhere. That means cisgender is the golden standard. Cisgender is normal. So if you want to live in this society, if you want to play the game to be a normal person, if you want to play along, you have to follow the rules. And the rules is that in the world, basically, not politically correct, but most of us will say, okay, when you say gender, you say, oh, are you a male or female? Are you a man or a woman? So there is like no in between. That means if they want to be normal, if they want to be accepted by cisgender people or by people in general, they have to play along, and that means they can only pick man or female. I mean, male or female. So they go all the way to the extreme. And well, just another piece of information, not included here, but there is some previous research actually saying that if we are talking about masculinity and femininity, transgender female are actually more feminine than cisgender female. They go all the way to like overcompensately to the extreme. But interestingly, for trans men, it's not the case. Trans men is less masculine than cis men. So perhaps it's about, I would attribute it as a social factor. Because if a trans man is not that masculine, you may still accept him. You may say, okay, well, a TB, or a feminine man, but not so manly, but it's still okay. Especially nowadays, Korean pop star, they don't sell masculinity; they sell and pretty faces. Yeah.
Okay, let's open the debate to the floor. Yeah. Press.
Hello.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. So I want to ask again, I think it is a rhetoric, and why do you think all countries of the world, more or less, at least the majority of the countries, they embrace the gender binary than what you're moving now? Why do you think the majority of the countries still keep to gender binary?
You mean the reasons why?
Yes.
Okay, I would just speculate. I would just think. I think there are a lot of reasons, especially like the social aspect and the historical aspect, of course. Like, I mean, well, put it this way, like we are, in Hong Kongers, most of us are having the Chinese heritage. And in the Chinese heritage, there is no such thing as something in between. The gender is just binary. That is historical. Now it's like we are trying to, forcibly put in one more category, or not category, but it's like a spectrum. So the whole idea is totally a novel thing. And I guess, although not many of the Hong Kong Chinese will say, oh, I am a very traditional Chinese person, or Confucian is my belief. Probably no. But from, just like that term, 长子嫡孫, that means the person is the eldest, or if I'm wrong, please bear with me. The person is the eldest son, and also the father is also the eldest among the siblings. So if the person is 长子嫡孫, he has the obligations to, continue the bloodline. This kind of Confucian thinking is deeply rooted in them. So I guess one of the big factors is that the cultural heritage. Because in Hong Kong, many scholars, they call it a Confucian heritage culture. It's not exactly a Confucian culture, but it's a Confucian heritage culture. So there is, secretly Confucian implicit influence deep down. I guess that is one of the big reasons. I think, at least in Hong Kong. So in other countries, and I'm not sure.
Thank you, Bami, and yeah, thank you for Marco's answers. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, I guess no. And then let's move to another presentation, and that would be Lauren. Yeah, Lauren, it's your turn.
Yes. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Vaughn, and I'm based in the history department at the University of Hong Kong. So today I'm going to be presenting a paper entitled Happy Valley Heterotopia, representing colonial order in a Hong Kong other space. So I imagine many of us are familiar with Happy Valley, probably today mostly for the race course. But I'm going to be talking today about the race course, the recreation ground, so that's in the infield, and the series of cemeteries on the western slopes. So as you can see, moving north to south, we have the Muslim cemetery, Catholic cemetery, the cemetery that at different times was called the Colonial, the English, the Protestant cemetery, but today is called the Hong Kong cemetery, then the Parsi cemetery, Hindu cemetery, and finally the Jewish cemetery. The period that this paper covers is 1841, so starting with the initial occupation of Hong Kong Island by the British, to 1918, which is when a disastrous fire happened on the race course. So Happy Valley was during this period was the space of apparently clear spatial and temporal divisions. And it functioned as this sort of model of colonial order and efficiency. You have one space for the living, another space for the dead. A schedule of usage determined who could use the recreation grounds on any given day. And unlike today, horse racing was confined to annual race days in February. So essentially, this space presented an ideal vision of colonial order in which each of Hong Kong's most prominent foreign communities was made visible as part of the larger colonial community. It maintained the hegemony of the dominant European group, and it cast the other groups as important collaborators in the colonial project. However, the Chinese, who were, of course, the colony's majority population, had no space for burial on the western slopes of the valley, nor were they members of the recreational clubs that shared rights to the infield. Thus, they were excluded from this vision of ideal colonial order represented by Happy Valley. The main exception to this was race days, where Chinese became undeniably visible in Happy Valley. And their presence, in essence, challenged this image of ideal order. So first, I want to define this idea of heterotopia. And this is a term that was coined by Michel Foucault, and he describes them as something like counter sites, a kind of effectively enacted utopia in which the real sites, all the other real sites that can be found within the culture, are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. Now, the heterotopia has been criticized for its loose and perhaps overly broad definition. However, it has also proven a useful framework for investigating how the arrangement, use, and symbolic associations attached to a space both reinforce and undermine existing power structures. So I will be, in the case of Hong Kong, I argue that Happy Valley functioned as a heterotopia as it was a space of experimental order, which both reflected real aspects of colonial political and social life, and served as a model of ideal social organization, albeit an unattainable one for the rest of the colony. However, it was not simply an effectively enacted utopia, but rather, like all heterotopias, it contained the seeds of its own contestation in its system of ordering, which upon scrutiny was ambiguous and unstable. I further argue that Happy Valley's development and exclusive nature played a role in framing the Chinese of Hong Kong as disorderly elements on the margins of colonial life. So in this presentation, I'm going to be looking first at the development of Happy Valley from this site associated with disease and dangerous miasmas into one that was strictly zoned for entertainment and recreation in the valley and the disposal of the dead on the slopes. I'll be looking at how this transformation contributed to a narrative of colonial triumph over the dangers of the tropical environment, and looking at how the exclusion of Chinese from this space was connected to the construction of Chineseness as threatening and disorderly. Next, I'll look at the cemeteries and how the ambiguities of inclusion looking at the ambiguities of inclusion and exclusion, demonstrating how arguments for the exclusion of Chinese revealed the order represented by Happy Valley to be fragile and tenuous. And finally, I'll look at the race course, exploring how Happy Valley's model of order was reinforced and simultaneously subverted during the annual race meetings. From its earliest days, Hong Kong was associated with the dangers of tropical living. The Wangnaichang Valley, soon to be renamed Happy Valley, was the largest naturally flat area on the north side of the island. And it was considered by many to be a promising area for development. However, in 1843, Hong Kong was struck by a devastating epidemic of malaria. And many of the deaths were concentrated around the military barracks at West Point and around the Happy Valley. Commentators at the time wrote that it was miasmas from the paddy fields and vegetation that were the cause of disease around Happy Valley. And this identification of the paddy fields as a source of miasma implicated local ways of living in the deaths of European soldiers and settlers. Happy Valley thus came to be seen as a particularly unhealthy part of a generally unhealthy island. So in 1845, when the old Protestant cemetery in Wan Chai filled, the space chosen for a larger new cemetery was on the western slopes of Happy Valley. So essentially you have the dead removed from the spaces of human habitation and quarantined in Happy Valley, a space that at this point has been condemned as uninhabitable. But as the slopes were filling with graves, the lower flat portion of Happy Valley began its transformation into a space for recreation. So as early as 1845, race meetings were organized at the bottom of Happy Valley. Carriage Road was completed around the same year. In 1846, the government bought out the land belonging to the last of the rice and sweet potato farmers in the area and began to drain the valley. So this began the process of taming the space. And essentially this process cast the Chinese farmers as forces of disorder, and their removal enabled the settlers to impose order on this supposedly dangerous space. Long after Happy Valley's transformation into a well-ordered and beloved colonial space, the cemeteries ensured that visitors to the valley had regular reminders of the fragility of life. There was a Hungarian visitor, Dr. Dezo Bozoki, who articulated this sort of narrative of colonial triumph over the tropical environment in his diaries in the early 20th century. So he wrote, previously, Hong Kong was an unhealthy island of pestilent air. This becomes clear enough when you stroll through Hong Kong's first cemeteries in the beautiful Happy Valley. The inscriptions on the gravestones and obelisks speak volumes about the island's past. Whole regiments, young lives were destroyed here by malaria, typhus, cholera, the plague, and of course, typhoons. However, the British, undeterred by any sacrifice nor disheartened by various calamities, worked relentlessly to make the island healthy. So this narrative provided a powerful argument for the importance of colonial control. It implied that the order which the colonial government imposed upon Hong Kong, both its environment and its people, kept the island's inherent dangers at bay. So moving on to the cemeteries, one of the main qualities of the Happy Valley cemeteries was their stability. So outside of Happy Valley, the cemeteries generally had no guarantee of permanence. One Chinese member of the sanitary board, in complaining that Chinese were not allowed to be buried in the Hong Kong cemetery, wrote that, or he said that what are called Chinese cemeteries are merely tracts of barren land set apart for the burial of Chinese dead of all classes, and the Chinese have no voice in their control. The government reserves to itself the right of resuming the land at any time and ordering their remains to be exhumed and reburied anywhere else as the government may be pleased to direct. So while the Happy Valley cemeteries were segregated, the boundaries that dictated inclusion and exclusion was not always clear or stable. In the case of the Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, and Parsi cemeteries, the boundaries were relatively predictable because these were fairly small communities whose numbers tended not to grow to include Chinese. However, the right to burial in the Protestant and Catholic cemeteries was complicated by the fact that members of both religions actively proselytized in Hong Kong. So the Catholic cemetery was the most racially inclusive cemetery of Happy Valley, and because it allowed the burial of any Catholic. And in fact, its appearance, which was considered to be crowded and less attractive, served as evidence that the exclusion of Chinese in the colonial cemetery was necessary. The colonial cemetery was the largest in Happy Valley. And despite its origins as the Protestant or English burial grounds, the colonial cemetery held the remains of quite a few people to whom none of those labels applied. Thus, it was the cemetery that served the dominant Anglican community, but it also served those of the foreign community for whom the other faith-specific cemeteries did not provide. So in 1909, a conflict arose regarding the right to burial in the in the colonial cemetery. And this was a conflict that arose initially in the sanitary board, but spilled over into the local newspapers. It was prompted by complaints about the burning of joss sticks around Japanese graves and the reinterment of a Chinese body from elsewhere in the colony. The arguments boiled down to whether the cemetery was a sacred Protestant burial ground or if it was the public cemetery of the colony. If classified as Protestant, this would allow for the exclusion of Chinese because there was already a Chinese Christian cemetery elsewhere. Members of the sanitary board in favor of formally excluding Chinese argued that if Chinese were allowed to be buried in the cemetery, it would fill within weeks, drawing on these long-established fears of orderly European space being overrun by disorderly Chinese. However, the colonial cemetery, unlike the other Happy Valley cemeteries, was tended by government employees, received government funding, and was overseen by the sanitary board. So one result of this 1909 conflict was the establishment of the Chinese Permanent Cemetery in Aberdeen. And this was to accommodate the, quote, better class of Chinese. And this accommodation outside of Happy Valley ensured the further exclusion of Chinese from Happy Valley. However, the 1909 conflict drew attention to the ambiguity of the boundaries that upheld the representation of colonial order in Happy Valley. Unlike during most of the rest of the year, annual race days, during annual race days, Chinese residents became undeniably visible in Happy Valley, sort of challenging and inverting the demographic ideal. However, the race days were not a complete inversion of the normative order. So the spectator spaces were essentially segregated, especially by class. And you also have social divisions further reinforced by the fact that representatives of various communities sponsored individual races. So those included the Hebrew Cup, the Lusitano Cup, and the Parsi Cup. And in contrast to that, you have what was known as the Native Scramble, which is where Chinese riders raced on native ponies. And you've got a description of that up here. 13 started and 4 or 5 of the riders fell off first go. The merriment of the spectators baffles all description. However, the dismounted cavaliers showed great pluck and got up grinning as if nothing had happened. And many of the quadrupeds came in without riders, seemingly enjoying the fun as much as anybody else. So, what we have here highlights Chinese presence and participation at the race. But it's also performed as this spectacle of chaos, and it's meant to be ridiculous in this controlled environment. And so it does so as this reassertion for the necessity of colonial order. I'm, in this final section, going to look at the 1918 racecourse disaster. And this disaster sort of revealed the order imposed on Happy Valley by the colonial government to be shallow and incomplete. So each year, the government auctioned off lots of land for the erection of mat sheds. These were temporary structures for accommodating spectators during the races. In 1918, 8 of the 19 lots were let to Chinese firms. So again, subverting this traditional order represented by Happy Valley. In 1918, a mat shed collapsed, initiating the collapse of the surrounding structures. And as the dry, flammable construction material fell, it landed on coals used for cooking. The resulting fire consumed the entire row of mat sheds and killed over 600 people, mostly Chinese, but also quite a few South Asians and Portuguese as well. The subsequent inquiry revealed that the stand owners and the government agencies had regularly neglected or failed to impose safety regulations in the building and use of mat sheds. So some examples are just that they did not prohibit smoking or cooking. They did not provide sufficient water. There was no limit on the number of people the structures could accommodate. The mat sheds were lashed together. And all of this sort of lack or neglect of safety regulations undermined the narrative that colonial control brought safety to colonial space. The inquiry also shed light on a range of activities that were not officially sanctioned, but frequently tolerated during the races. And all of this exposed the shallow nature of government control and colonial order, which appeared to prevail in Happy Valley. So in conclusion, the organization, control, and partition of space in Hong Kong's Happy Valley made it a site that conveyed an ideal of colonial order. This order maintained the dominance of the British establishment and cast the other members of the foreign community as collaborators in the colonial project, while maintaining their separation. Chinese, on the other hand, came to be associated with disorder and were excluded from Happy Valley and the order it represented. However, the annual races revealed the shallow nature of this order and brought to the forefront the many people and activities that were normally excluded from Happy Valley and what it represented. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. And yes, first of all, any questions from the floor? Okay, if not, then just one very simple question regarding to the concept of heterotopia. Yeah, other than Happy Valley, do you think that there are other places that could be a heterotopia in Hong Kong?
Certainly. I think that, I mean, one of the criticisms of heterotopias is like people have described grocery stores and office buildings and parking lots and like anything somebody has argued is a heterotopia. I think that its value is more in that like it can serve as this framework for looking at systems of ordering and questioning, and how questioning those systems of ordering reflects the like existing hierarchies and how they're undermined.
Okay, thank you. And yes, and if no questions from the floor, and then we can move to the next presentation. And yeah, and that would be Winnie.
So if I want to go to the next page. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Winnie from Hong Kong Baptist University School of Communication and Film. Today I'm presenting on the paper of the new adaptation of Yi Shu's novels and the cultural boundaries from between Hong Kong and Shanghai. So Yi Shu, if you have ever read her work or heard of her, she is one of the most famous novelists in Hong Kong from the 70s to the 90s. And her novel mostly deal with urban romance stories in that period in Hong Kong. So there are two trends of adaptation from Yi Shu's work to TV or film. The first trend lies in around like 80s to 90s Hong Kong, and a couple of her books were made into movies, and it happened only in Hong Kong. And it stopped for a while. Then recently, her books are popular in China because they were adapted to a few TV dramas. And then in two of these TV dramas, they completely moved the background city of Hong Kong to Shanghai when they reworked the story. So this paper attempts to examine how cross-regional adaptation works in the transnational urban Chinese context, specifically in Hong Kong and Shanghai. So the questions to examine is first, like why is it transplanted to Shanghai but not the other mainland cities? And then also, how are the adjusted and localized stories in Shanghai received by the audience? And then at last, in what ways these adaptations are similar and in what ways they are different from the original text. So to answer the first question, like why Shanghai, why not the other mainland cities? So first of all, Shanghai and Hong Kong, they actually share a lot of commonalities. So by geography, they were both cities by the biggest river of China, therefore commanding the physical and social capital of the rich hinterland. So historically, they both witnessed the turbulent modern history of China and became the site of Western imperialism and colonialism. And then right now, they are both emerged as the greatest hub for trade and industry in Asia. So basically, they're both like international and expensive and rich cities. And so as for the development and the history of these two cities, they don't just like go steady and rise high as two like parallel lifelines. So they each have their rise and falls. So as you all know, like Hong Kong in the very beginning was a fishing village, and then became a British colony, and then it was, but at the same time, especially from the 1920s to the 30s, Shanghai was the most advanced industrial and commercial center in Asia at the time. So Hong Kong had its drastic upturn during the 1946 to 1950 Civil War in China. And it was also the period when many mainland refugees fled to Hong Kong because of the war. And Yi Shu, her whole family was one of these refugees at the time. And so as Hong Kong continued to rise, Shanghai, especially from the 60s to 90s, become more socialist because of a series of socialist movement and revolution after the PRC. And then, so as Hong Kong carried out the majority of China's external trades throughout these 3 decades, then Shanghai inevitably insulated from its competition with Hong Kong. And then even during the reform, China was like centering on development of the southern areas. So Shenzhen and other Guangdong cities became rich, and Shanghai was once again elected until the 1990s. After the opening of Pudong, then Shanghai quickly sped up its development and become as competitive as Hong Kong economically. So you can see Shanghai and Hong Kong really have a lot of similarities, and very superficially, they have very similar skyline, and they have these skyscrapers, the centers of business. But politically and culturally, there are a lot of invisible differences that lead to my discussion of these adaptation works later that makes the imposition of Hong Kong on Shanghai problematic. Then I'll go to the theoretical framework. So I'll be short on this section. So the main theory is based on upper-derived scape theory, especially the mediascape and ethnoscape. I'll briefly explain what they are. So from upper-derived terms, quote, ethnoscape means the landscape of people who constituting the shifting world in which we live, and the person refers to immigrants, travelers, and migrants, end quote. And for mediascape, it refers to both to the production and dissemination of information via various mediums such as newspaper, television stations, and film production studios, end quote. So the other book is actually from a very famous Hong Kong scholar, Eric Ma. He interpreted these theories by expanding the concept of scape theory to ethnoscape, quote, as the life world, life experience, and social interaction of all ordinary people, and mediascape to the media discourses available to the general public of the imagined community, end quote. So basically, Ma expanded upper-derived scape theory, and based on that, he wrote this book, Desiring Hong Kong, Consuming South China, and the book is mainly draws on trans-border cultural politics and used the term borders and boundary to respectively describe the geographical division between communities and the imaginalized between cultures. So trans-border cultural imagination occurs when 2 places of differentiating materiality and ideologies are separated by borders. So for example, when Hong Kong and South China is separated by borders, there is imagination. And then also when Shanghai and Hong Kong separated by borders, there are also like different kind of cultural imagination. So to deepen that discussion on these theories, because the work I'm discussing is transplanted from one locality to another. And the political and geographical boundary will present challenges in ways this work got adopted. And especially the ethnoscape happened in a novel, as I mentioned, they were all written from the 70s to 90s. So they were within some sort of historical content, but the mediascape on TV is very contemporary. So there is a potential historical misconception between the ethnoscape and the mediascape. And also the novel of Yi Shu was appropriated in the context of Shanghai that can be potentially lost in censorship because of the different cultural environment between Shanghai and Hong Kong. I have very detailed textual analysis, which I wouldn't have time to talk about all of them. It's gonna like completely bore you, but I will just pick up some examples. Because from yesterday's workshop, textual analysis is very labor intensive, and I totally get that because it's like novels and TV drama, like 40-episode TV drama, and then so one example is like, so I'll just make it very brief. And in the novel, it's about, so the novel, the first half of my life, 我的前半生 is about this very wealthy, typical wealthy Hong Kong housewife married to a doctor, and she lived in a big house, and she has like very good taste in clothing and then in interior design. So that's how her life is in this passage. If you can read, she basically picked out very classic styles of wardrobes and then also expensive fabrics. So she's very elegant. And then on the TV show, as you can see, a lot of, not just my opinion, it's actually from a lot of the book fans, they cannot internalize this version of Zijun, which is like the main character of the book, because she's like wearing red with green, and it's not very classy, it's not very fashionable choice of wardrobe. And so I think the wardrobe is just one superficial like reflection, but I think if we go deeper, it is really, we can't see that familiarized version of this typical Hong Kong wealthy housewife who have a certain lifestyle, but what we see is a very stereotypical representation of this rising new rich mainlanders in China, and that's the gap that makes the audience feel disoriented if they actually read the book and then they compare it to the TV. Okay, so there is another example. This is a very famous, not famous, like very popular TV drama just from earlier this year. It's based on Yi Shu's other famous novel, 流金岁月, and this novel is actually adapted twice. First time in 1988 as a Cantonese Hong Kong movie, and then second time the Chinese TV drama based in Shanghai. And then in the movie, so first to very briefly talk about this novel, is about a girl, her journey of class leaping. So she was a very poor working class, and then she earned money through transactional relationship with men. So she's basically an escort working in the nightclub. So her accumulation of wealth is very quick. So in the movie, they almost 100% represent that by showing it into a sequel that's actually based on a paragraph from the novel, that this girl is moving from a very small room in a shared apartment to an apartment of her own, and then eventually to a big house. So this part stick to a very high fidelity to the original work, but then in the TV drama, is completely removed. So we don't see this part because if we see it on Chinese TV, then it's not going to pass censorship, because as early as 2010, the SARP department, which is the censorship department in China has already put out a rule saying that there's no showcase of an orthodox relationship on TV. So which means you can't show relationship of younger girl with older man for money. And it's not very ethical, it's not morally right. And, but does it mean that there aren't people doing it at all in mainland China? That's not true. I'm pretty sure there are people doing it. But these two girls are still leading a very extravagant life in the TV drama. They have all these expensive clothes and outfits, but we don't know where they get that from if they're just two ordinary girls, right? So why are they still having these luxury items and beautiful styles, but it's not really telling the narrative? And that's because if Shanghai wants to create that mediascape that can be an inspiration for the less developed areas and cities like Hong Kong used to do, then they have to have these elements, but their narrative doesn't contribute to that. So that will create a very forward-leaping mediascape that is in contrast and in a great distance with the lagging ethnoscape. And these distances and gaps will create an emotional friction that provoke the anxieties among the audience when they watch these TV dramas. And so the conclusion is that so in sum, though Hong Kong and Shanghai share a lot of similarities, so you thought that, well, if I want to change a Hong Kong story and make it happen in Shanghai, is very natural because they're both big cities. But in fact, the culture embedded in the Yishu's novel that's only addressing Hong Kong in a certain period. And it's not really transferable and translatable into the city of Shanghai. So this paper is still a work in progress. And I think for me, the next step is I'm trying to frame it into a transmedia, transhistorical, and transborder investigation of this kind of adapted works. And hopefully that will bring more insights to it. And I personally do believe that soap operas and this popular culture says a lot about people. And even though they don't really care about this text. Yeah, so that's the end of my presentation. And thank you very much for listening.
So yes, any questions from the floor? Okay, then I have one question for you, Winnie. Yeah, I'm thinking of how do I put it? Yeah, I'm thinking of, would there be another theoretical framework to address this cross-cultural boundaries, the phenomenon here. One of the framework I can think of is about the so-called the transculture. That means the cultural crossover, and they interact, and after all, and they have a good interaction and become a melting pot and produce some new things. And this is one extreme. And other extreme is so-called the cultural exploitation, which means that a place or a city is treated as a resources and to be mined and to be shipped to home, and so that for consumption. I'm not sure whether I was right that I put this kind of theoretical framework into this story, but just in case, what do you think about that framework would be work in your case that you presented, or would you think that this is, let's say, put it more simple, would it be if according to the presentation from you, would that be a case for the transculture, or would that be a case for cultural exploitation? Yeah, your thoughts.
I think well, thanks for bringing that up. I think it definitely can apply to both, because, well, first of all, it's transcultural, and as my presentation has would also, like speak to that. But for cultural exportation, that's a very good point, because I believe when China is making these television dramas, they are definitely thinking of cultural exportation, because they want to have something that's, China always want to produce a TV or film text that is so fashionable in a sense that would attract people for consumption, like not just films like the fifth generation, like Zhang Yimou or Chen Kaige. Like those films, they were great films in the history of Chinese cinema, but they're not something that can be consumed. And but TV drama, like text like that, like soap operas, it's almost if you compare it to K-pop and to Korea drama, they're really heading to that and try to have that the same kind of popularity over the world, like, and that's also called soft power, right? And I think that's actually a very good direction. It's just for the length of this paper and the presentation, I don't really have the chance to include that, but yeah, but thank you very much.
Yes, and other questions from the floor? Yeah, Alex, please.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. Actually, you made me wondering, should I read her works just for educational reasons? I mean, I have no interest in watching a movie, but maybe I can learn something about Hong Kong from her books, not about her romances. Would you recommend me looking at this?
You mean, can you repeat that?
I mean, would you recommend me reading her books if I want to learn something about Hong Kong, not about her romances?
Yeah, you mean the original?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
I would, but it's also very, to be honest, they're very classic works in popular writing, but they're also dated, like these books, because it's mostly addressing from the 70s to 90s, which a lot of people would conceive that as like the golden periods. And then what is the clearly not applicable contemporarily. And so a lot of fans of this book who are still reading it will see them as nostalgic, more than getting to know Hong Kong, because I wouldn't see.
Nostalgic is good enough, actually.
Yeah, but no, in a nostalgic sense, definitely. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Okay.
But thank you very much.
Okay, other questions? Okay, if no, then let's move on. And yes, CC, that is your turn. Thank you.
Yes. Testing. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shang Xixi, and I'm from the CTU University, the School of Law. Today, my topic is public policy in the mutual enforcement of civil and commercial awards and judgments between mainland China and Hong Kong. Although the topic is in the doctrine of public policy, and my research question is on the operation of this doctrine. And today, you can see my outline. My presentation will be divided into the 3 parts. One is why this question, and the second part is how I deal with this question. And the final part, I will deal with you my own observation on this question. Then at first, I will introduce to you the legislative and the theoretical basis for this question. This is also why I want to conduct research on this question. Until now, there are 3 arrangements between Hong Kong and mainland China on the mutual recognition and enforcement of its awards and judgments in the area of commercial and civil law. The one is on the arrangements of awards. The other 2 are on the judgments. And from these 3 arrangements, you can see there is a similar clause which can be incited to refuse the awards and judgments delivered by other jurisdictions. And while in the similar clause, you can see there are different terms, social public interests and public policy. These are the discrepancy between mainland China and Hong Kong. And this means mainland China may be refuse the enforcement of awards and judgments on the excuse of the violation of social and public interests, while the Hong Kong jurisdiction will refuse the recognition on the basis of the violation of public policy. So even in the same arrangements, there are differences between mainland China and Hong Kong. About the theoretical analysis on the public policy, although you can see the civil law jurisdiction and common law jurisdiction, they have a little difference towards this doctrine, but actually there is also consensus. At first, in the researches, and you can see the public policy has low precise definition, and also there is low only specific examples of this of the public policy, but the consensus goes to the public policy may be divided into the domestic public policy and the international public policy. This means in the international forum, at least when one country wants to incite the doctrine of public policy, it should take the international nature of the case into account. On the other hand, it also takes the legal system of the foreign country into consideration. So the final, if one country wants to refuse judgment or awards on the basis of public policy, it should be on the basis of the combination between the international public policy and the domestic public policy. While come to the Chinese context between mainland China and Hong Kong, it seems that the thing is a little different. At first, there is a political reality, the one country and 2 systems regime. So this means the mainland China and Hong Kong are in the same country. So they are within one country, within one sovereignty. So the situation is not the same with the situations in the international treaties or international conventions. And because of different legal cultures, different legal systems, this makes the things more complex, and the Hong Kong follows the common law jurisdiction's tradition, while the mainland China is more not more from the French and Germany law, so it's more like the civil law. So you can see as a result, the legal culture, the legal system, the philosophy in the law, and of course the operation of the law, the judicial and arbitration environment in two jurisdictions are also different. And as analyzed from the legal documents, you can see the term used in the same arrangements are also different. So there are so many different, but the gap must be narrowed. The mainland China and Hong Kong has more and more economical ties, and also there are more and more judgments and awards which need to be enforced and recognized by the other jurisdiction. So in this situation, I think at first we need to see the limitation from the public policy is how interprets into jurisdictions. So this is the origins of my research question, how the doctrine of public policy operates in two jurisdictions within one country. Then to resolve this question, I collected some judgments. So although I collected some judgments, I have to admit that my research methodology is a doctrinal one. So I collected 12 judgments from the Beida Fabao, and 27 judgments from the Lexis Advanced Hong Kong. In all these judgments, the doctrine of public policy is in detail discussed, and this is an important legal issue in all these judgments. And although the amount of the number of the judgments are not so many, but I think it's a good thing, because in the beginning of the arrangement, many scholars has worried about the abuse of public policy, but it seems until now, since 1999, there are only these words and judgments which discuss the public policy. I think this is the way to see both jurisdictions has narrative attitudes towards the application of this doctrine. Well, from the mainland judgments and awards in Hong Kong courts, we can see at least the Hong Kong courts has insisted the pro-enforcement policy behind this arrangement, and the courts also have a narrow attitudes towards the public policy limitation, and as analyzed, the Hong Kong law follows the common law jurisdiction. So the public policy doctrine in the Hong Kong courts mainly goes to the root of morality and justice in Hong Kong. So when the Hong Kong courts are consider whether the enforcements should be refused or not, then they will consider whether the enforcement, the consequence of the judgment would seriously damage the morality and justice of Hong Kong. So at this time, normally they will rely on the recognized courts and the supervisory courts decisions. And this can be seen from they refuse to go to the merits of the course, and they insist on the mechanistic principles. And the supervisory courts have more words to say in some special legal issues. As for the reasons giving rise to the refusal, they mainly combined with other some procedural legal issues like the presenting to the case, lack of proper notice, and presenting the case. Until now, there are two reasons which are incited to see the case has been regarded as the violation of Hong Kong public policy. The one is about the bias. The other is the Hong Kong court said there is the ignorance of key issues in mainland judgments. About the bias, from this is from the King Eye case, and actually this is a landmark case in the enforcement of mainland awards. And in this case, you can see the Hong Kong court has treated the mainland awards as an international awards, and it distinguished the actual buyers and the appearance of buyers. And they say because it should be treated like the international awards. So if there is only the appearance of buyers, so the awards should not be refused. Only if awards were a judgment is delivered based on the actual buyers, then the court may refuse the about the ignorance of key issues, the Hong Kong court has said the key and material issues raised for determination, either by a court or the arbitral tribunal, should be considered and dealt with fairly, while the failure to deal with an issue and the failure to provide sufficient reasons for the decision are different. Not every issue should be dealt, and not failure to deal with issue is regarded as the ignorance of key issues. So such as what can be considered as the sufficiency of the reasoning, the court held the reasoning is expressed to enable parties to understand how and why a conclusion is reached on a particular issue. Only if the basis on which a material finding is made, then the court would say this reasoning is sufficient. This is an example. In the first case, the Hong Kong court said held the issue is a legal issue, while in the second case, the court said the issue is not a material issue, so the award should not be refused. Then came to the mainland China. The mainland China. We can see the mainland China also strictly interpreted this doctrine, and their review mainly limited to the consequence of the enforcement, and also care about the procedural issues rather than substantive law. And to be specific, we find two rules. One is that the mainland China courts said the violation of mainland laws cannot be regarded as the violation of public policy. On the other hand, the state-owned companies, which always gain the advantages treatment, now has no such advantages position. The mainland court said the violation of the interests of this kind of contracting parties can be regarded as the violation of social and public interest. As for the violation violation of the valid arbitral agreements is also a reason for the mainland China's courts to refuse to enforce and recognize the Hong Kong awards. It seems from this refusal, we can say the mainland China seems to tend to treat the Hong Kong awards like the domestic awards. So that's all my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, again, any questions from the floor? Okay, if no, CC, one simple question for you. And yes, of course, your focus is the mutual recognition and enforcement of the civil and commercial judgment and arbitral awards here. I think here you focus on actually is the how do I put it? Yeah, is the I think please correct me if I were wrong. Is the attitude towards the same ordinance, and it's the basic difference is that they are Hong Kong and China have some different attitudes towards the same ordinance, and causing the difference in their their sentences, right? This is of course one. I would say I'm not sure, but one of the witness or one of the places that we have to pay attention to. But would there be other limitations or other places that we have to pay attention other than this difference between Hong Kong and China?
You mean like the parties who joined the litigation and their feeling towards the operation of the doctrine?
Yeah. Other than this, can you think of other places that we have to pay attention to?
Yes, I think it's a good question. Actually, I have never thought about this, but a few years ago, I saw a paper which said use the sociological method to conduct legal research, and one way is to transfer the direction of the observation, and the professor said maybe we could conduct a research on the litigation's attitudes towards the operation of this doctrine. Yeah, maybe I can work on your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I think no questions from the floor, and then we can move to the last presentation. Yeah, from Vivian. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Vivian from City University of Hong Kong, and I'm doing research on sociolinguistics. So my paper is about the official virtual linguistic landscape of on social media in Hong Kong through a chronotopic approach. And in this presentation, I will first briefly talk about the rationale of my research, and then I will introduce some key concepts on my research and the methodology, and I'll give some examples of my data, and then I will conclude the presentation. So for the rationale, so the international image of Hong Kong is based on its bilingual image. And the sociolinguistic research on linguistic issues in Hong Kong has also been guided by the bilingual logic. So, which contributes to the tendency of prioritizing bilingual data. And importantly, there are discrepancies between such ideological image of Hong Kong and the data collected. So in this research, I try to empirically move away from such bilingual logic. And theoretically, I also want to move away from the language-centered approach and foreground the context, because I discovered that language proficiency constitute only one of the factors for understanding the message in general and in my data. Now I'll introduce some of the key concepts of these studies. So in linguistic landscape, we study the displayed language in public space. This include the language of public road signs, advertising billboards, street names, place names, etc. And by official, it means signs related to government places and public authorities. And by non-official, it includes everything non-governmental, such as commercial and individual signs. In the digital era, we have to extend the linguistic landscape studies to the online environment, which is what the scholar called the virtual linguistic landscape. And after almost 2 decades, the concept has also been extended to include non-linguistics elements such as fonts, size, colors, and drawings. So in short, is looking at the science as a whole, which is what they call the semiotic landscapes. So here are some examples. So the first example is on the top is when people only focus on the language, and the bottom one is people also look at the images and the graphic of like in the Chinese words. So what is chronotope? Chronotopic approach means using chronotope as an analytical tool to analyze the signs. Chronotope is a term coined by a Russian theorist Bakhtin, which means time-space. His work has been reinterpreted by scholars such as Aga, who argues that chronotope is the depiction of time, place, and personhood. And here is how he defined a chronotope. A chronotope is a semiotic representation of time and place peopled by certain social types. In other words, for a given or specific time space, we expect the presence of certain type of people. And at first, scholars studied the interaction of large scale chronotopes, such as backward versus modern East and West Germany, Darwinism, and creationism. And Aga also called these as mass-mediated chronotopes. People experience or gain knowledge of these different chronotopes through TV, radio, newspaper, and novels. Scholars such as Blumer has further elaborated the concept. So chronotope can be seen as invocable chunk of history that organize the indexical order of discourse. In other words, shared experience. He argues that chronotope is not simply a context, but a precise and detailed mobile unit of context, and it operates at different scales. For instance, university life in general would be a large scale chronotope shared by most of us. However, we also have our individual experience of university life that is not the same, such as a joke told by a particular professor in a particular class. So why chronotope? If you look at the synonyms for chronotope, such as context, culture, stereotype, it seems that there's nothing new, but the problem of these synonyms is that they are untheorized, static, one-dimensional, and factual. So what is new about chronotype? It is a theorization of context and settings and personhood. Importantly, it stresses on the interconnectedness of time, space, and personhood represented in language and discourse. It reveals the process of meaning making by foregrounding the context of language use. Specific time-space configuration will also guide and constrain social, cultural, and linguistic behavior. For example, if the time is Paris Fashion Week, the space would be the heart of Paris, and the expected type of personhood will be the well-dressed celebrities. It constrains your speech and language into talking about fashion. So you're not talking about, I don't know, politics or other things, but in a fashion week, you will talk about fashion. Or I would like to draw on, like yesterday, Dr. Siu, Carsten Siu's example. If I want to use this framework to explain his studies of night drifters, I would say the time is midnight, the space would be the public housing in Hong Kong, and the expected personhood would be the youngsters, the night drifters. Yeah, and then this also constrained he as a researcher's language use. For example, he will not talk like a professor in university, but he will use some street language or like even swear words to talk with the youth so as to approach them and understand like what they think. So quickly, the research methodology would be, this paper is based on the data collection from the Facebook page of Big Waster, so that's Saigwei, and also Adoc. The reason for choosing these two pages is because these two maskers are regarded as the most successful and popular current government campaigns. And they accumulated a lot of followers on the public, like social media. So data were collected manually from Facebook, and the time frame is set for the choice of data because of the excessive amount of data. So that would be posts and posters published in 2021 with similar and recurrent topics. And I will use the ethnographically grounded multimodal analysis. And particularly, I'll conduct the analysis by using Chronotype as an analytical tool. So here are some examples of my data. I will group them into international connections because these posts draws on the current issues and readopt them for their communicative goals. For example, I'll categorize the chronotypes into the here and now and the there and then to show the repurposing of other events and their alignment to the current communicative goals. So the here and now is what the purpose of the campaign. So the first type of chronotype is the social media page itself, because social media has some constraints on the language used on social media. For example, you will find written Cantonese as the normative language on these pages. Okay. And the goal is to spread the message of don't waste food. And then you will see him contextualizing and reappropriating the 80s pop song, Never Gonna Give You Up, which is related to a trending topic. And the there and then is the text, of course, coming from a pop song. And it is also related to the internet prank Rick Rolling. And the song, most importantly, the song hit 1 billion of views in August on YouTube, mainly because of the Rick Rolling phenomenon. So I mean, all these chronotypes operates on scales, which means it depends on which chronotypes you have exposed to. For example, some older people, they know about the song, but they do not know about the Rick rolling. And they may not know why, like nowadays people are still talking about these old songs. But for the younger generation, they know this song because of Rick rolling, the internet pranks. So, and the creative linguistic practices here is done through the alignment of chronotypes. So of the present and the like older ones. So they align the literal meaning of the lyrics with Big Waste's promotional goal, which can be read as do not give up your food easily and do not let your food down into the bin. And what the Big Waste is trying to portray is like he is hip and cool, like through this kind of newsjacking. Another example is very similar is Attack. So same here. The here and now is a promotion on social media. He always needs to spread the message of keeping Hong Kong clean. And he also reappropriate the breaking news of the obstruction of Suez Canal for his communicative goal in March. So as we may remember, in March, the Suez Canal was obstructed by the container of a Taiwanese container. And here he tried to do also a multi-voice, the hashtag like evergreen, because Attack's color is always green. And there's a well-known container company name called Evergreen. And he also wanted to show his dedication to the environmental protection. And all these alignments of like different things, well, he tried to do a metaphor of the container blocking the canal as the Hong Kong waste problem. So the bulky waste left on the street, which block the pedestrians. And also he's trying to play the cool and hip image by newsjacking, 即係抽水咁樣。Yeah, so so it operates on different scales. So if you only look at the picture and you don't know about the news about Suez Canal, you would not know what happened, like why he is putting that on. And if you do not read the text, you will not know the problem of the bulky waste in Hong Kong. So the conclusion is, I want to make a conclusion drawing from these examples that the accessibility to the message operates at various scales. So you can see that the Suez Canal case is a larger scale than the English pop song Never Gonna Let You Down, because what is a small scale, and then in other words, there's a power difference between different chronotypes. And I would like to say more chronotypes identify, the higher resolution one has to the corresponding signs. It also means that you have more accessibility to the message. And one important thing is language proficiency constitutes only one of the factors for understanding the signs. And a chronotypic approach to the Hong Kong official virtual linguistic landscape enable us to understand the meaning-making process through foregrounding the context of language use. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Vivian. And yes, any questions from the floor? Okay, then one simple question for you, Vivian. You think in your presentation, you think that Big Waster and ADAC is relatively successful in this kind of promotion, right? And in the virtual spaces. How about the others? Others, yeah, actually, in Hong Kong, not just these two. Another famous one that also led to a heated debate is the figure produced by the fire service that call anyone, and I'm not sure, but I think that that would be a funnier case for integrating into a chronotope because in this sense, for Big Waster and ATAC, actually they have more constraints in terms of their in terms of their appearance or in terms of their context, but for anyone, you know that anyone, that term is already trying to across or beyond that boundary. No, I'm not sure, but what do you think about that? Would that be more funny? Of course, you do a very good job in providing in the analysis for Big Waster and that. Of course, that's sure. I really appreciate that. But would there be a funnier case for, let's say, we put the similar analysis on anyone?
Yeah, I realize that there are like different mascots used by the Hong Kong government, but I said these two are like the most popular and most doable one because, for example, lazy lion is also very cute, but he is really lazy. You don't find a lot of posts from that. So like in terms of data is very insufficient. And actually a lazy lion also plays on a pun about like lazy. And anyone is also like in terms of data is not very specific, and also I mean, the frequency of the post is not as much as Big Waster and ATAC because, as you may know, I think ATAC is outsourced to a it's managed by an outsourced company, marketing company. But we consider this as also a Hong Kong government like mouthpiece because they're representing the Hong Kong government, so it's also official. So I think it is the doability and the availability of the data that makes me choose these two mascots. And also in terms of followers, they are the most they have the most followers, and also they can be seen in the city. For example, in MTR station, in bus stops, in tram station. But I've never seen other publications or publicity of anyone in public places. And because I think like environmental protection and recycling is quite a global issue as well. So yeah, I think that justifies my choice.
Thank you, Vivian. And yes, any other suggestions, comments from the floor? Okay, if no, then, and I think that concludes the first day of our annual conference. And once again, thank you guys, and yeah, and of course the audience with us on the Facebook. And yes, and I think that concludes our first day. And thank you very much, all of you. Thank you.